welcome. It's good to see you all. This is going to be it's a prototype of what we will. I'll kind of get into it, but it's good to see you all, and I'm still wrapping my mind around the diverse disciplines represented here. It's quite enormous. But before I kick off, I wanted to introduce Salim Mohammed, who is a fellow cartographer with us. His background is in geography and economics, and he's a librarian of GIS. So definitely one of the people important in the future of the world, that we're all becoming very digital. I thought I'll have Salim say a few things about this.
Sure, yeah. So welcome to the David Ramsey Map Center. My name is Salim Mohammed, as I mentioned. I'm the head and curator of the center. In a previous life, I was a GIS librarian, so this is something we put together over the last several years, but the center's been open for the last 3. And we focus on here on the intersection between historic cartographic information and technology. So we do a lot of innovative stuff around technology. We have a touch screen, a very large presentation screen, an 8K screen. We have several Oculus Rifts, and we also have HoloLenses. We try to really, the idea here is that the center is that we co-locate the physical item, the physical map. Maybe it could be like the Lewis and Clark map, for example, but then we turn that around and use that as data and start overlaying those things more using the technology around us. So we'd like to be as much as possible on the cutting edge of cartographic knowledge, especially in historic. So when Addie came in and proposed this, I thought this was apropos because it's ecosystem thinking, it's geography, it's collocation, it's all those things. So I wish you all a successful meeting here today. I just wanted to mention quickly that this is a rare map center, and so it'll just be the water in close containers fine, but otherwise nothing else, no food and drink. And just be mindful of materials around you. So welcome and a successful meeting. All right, thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to give you a rough timeline. But one of the key things is that at the end, we're going to do both reflection and a few exercises as we wrap up. So it will be the synthesis that I want to place a lot of emphasis. The order, there's a thematic order, but because of certain schedules, I have moved things around a bit, so we won't go according to the thematic order. But you can, because you're all cartographers, you can make your way through it. So let me give that out. Okay, as usual in a number of our activities, we often like to always begin with a bit of improv, because that's the way of life. So let me please ask you to please stand up. Okay, we'll play. Victor, you can come. Oh, you have to be okay. Okay, so stretch out just to, I know you've already done a bit of stretching. Okay. And we play a quick round of the air ball, in which I'm going to throw you a ball, and it's you catch it with the sound that I throw it, and you can throw it to somebody else with a different sound. So that's a very, very key part. So if you're ready, does everybody know the game, air ball? Okay, so I'm going to throw you a ball of any size, with a sound, and you catch it with that sound. And then you throw it to somebody else with a different sound. We'll see how that goes. Are you ready? Okay. No, with the sound I gave you. Yeah.
Pop. Pew. Pew. Chow.
Ciao.
Pew. Oh, chow.
Yeah! Yeah!
Wow.
Wow. Catch.
Catch. Duck.
Duck.
Wow. Okay, there's a second ball.
Wow.
Keep moving.
Oh, your second.
Yeah, throw that.
Boom.
Ah. He did.
There's just one ball. Where's the
Oh.
other ball?
We lost one.
Okay.
No.
Yo, push.
Okay, I'll put another ball into play.
Oh, my goodness.
Duck.
Moo.
Moo.
Shot.
Shusha. Salam.
Whoop. Whoop. Hit it.
Hit it.
Okay, thank you. Let's go.
Is our video release cover this? Because I'd like to annotate my release.
Okay. This is very important. One of the key, please sit down. One of the very key things why we play the game is that if we had continued, it forces us to begin to listen. Because listening is a very critical part of design. The other part that the game does is that it gets us to move. A lot of information now coming from the neuroscience shows that our mind actually works because we move. And so being able to, the very early cartographers were really moving, and today we're a bit more sedentary, so we're not really using our full capacity. So this is very much a part of how we tend to begin a lot of our design thinking, not for play, but really as part of the ritual, as part of the prayer, if you will, of how we get things done. I wanted to share with you a 5 minutes video that helps to explain some of the challenges that we are going to wrestle with today. And some of you may have seen it, but let me play it. Sorry, it's good. I'm going to bring the video. Is it in the phone? This one, yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm real behind now. Some going back and forth on that. It is a mess.
Professor? Tycoon? Tycoon?
Okay, I got no idea.
How come I got both of your mind and you're not really caught up with somebody?
I changed my view to go through all this about housing. It's hard to keep people in their homes, if they can't afford to stay there.
This dinner is a remarkable moment.
It brought together all of the players from the financial crisis of 2008, the people who were actually in the room, in the moment, to have a conversation about what went right and what went wrong. In the 2008 financial panic, there's no playbook for this stuff. There's no roadmap. There's no instruction manual on what to do.
We're trying to think of the most hated moment in the crisis.
Yeah, there's a lot of candidates.
I think the most hated program was AIG, by far.
When you think about this group of people, Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and Tim Geithner, and you think about their different experiences, their sensibility, how they approach life. In Hank, you have the deal maker. His word is his bond. If he says he's good for something, he's good for it.
We've come up with a whole bunch of policies which are about jobs and growth.
Ben Bernanke, he was an economics professor at Princeton. He spent his whole career thinking about and studying the Great Depression. He was built for this moment.
I have a research paper that I'm giving on Thursday, and these papers all be on the crisis.
And then there's Tim Geithner. You know, some people thought he looked too young for the job, or he looked like he worked on Wall Street. But he was a government guy. He'd spent his whole career in government working on global financial panics.
I remember McConnell was saying to me in January, we're against almost everything you're doing, and we're going to fight you on all of it, and it's working for us.
It's pretty remarkable to think about how they came together and what ultimately happened. The 2008 financial crisis was far beyond the confines of Wall Street. The good news is that the economy rebounded. The bad news is how the public understands and thinks about what happened. Because of the financial crisis, today there's distrust in government, there's distrust in big institutions, there's distrust in this idea of elites. It has led to the populism that we see in our politics today. It's a straight line.
It ain't trouble for millions of American homeowners as a slowing housing market has turned some mortgages into time bombs.
One failed mortgage might not threaten the whole financial system. Millions of them could.
This one.
34 subprime mortgage companies have gone bust in just
Okay. Should we compare it to our meeting today? But in a sense, part of what that revealed came back to how our own research started. That we started looking at design because of the crisis that happened with the Japanese auto industry and the manufacturing in the US. And ever since then, almost every 5 to 10 years, a major institution collapses within the country. And part of this is because we're actually moving from one particular, the industrial, into digital. But it's happening much faster every time. And if you watch the end of that movie, they actually didn't know what to do. And so what we have found as in that struggle that we had to do in the 1980s and 1990s, which resulted in the ABET 2000, which was a new way to train engineers in the US because of the Japanese. We had to basically revamp the whole of engineering education, revamp the whole of how we practice manufacturing. And so with that sensibility in mind, as we've continued our research, I have been quite sensitive to people who indicate some degree of foresight in terms of what could be coming. And that's why I brought you together today. In your various capacities, which I've kind of seen and exchanged with you, you exhibit a foresight, an inkling for what might be. Either you are mapping the problem or you are aware of the problem, have a deep sensitivity for the problem, you have some idea of solution, But what we have seen is that the solution requires a lot of people, a lot of discipline, any of the solutions. And so I thought, well, why don't we all just come together and see what emerges? One of the people who taught me that technique was Sharik here. And he made a point several years ago when I met him that he's not an expert in my field, so he can't tell me what to do. He'll rather listen to me. So even as I pick the topics for you, I'm not the expert in your field. I couldn't be. So those topics were mainly proposals. The synthesis has to be collective. It's difficult for, when I saw what happened, look at financial crisis, there's some people that will say, yes, we knew what was going to happen, but did you have a solution? And so the idea that really as we move into digital sphere, we will need more collectives like this. And part of my hope today is that we begin to prototype how we can do things in the future. So this is a prototype. How do we work? If this was our workspace and we were to design a new mission, what would we do? What would we, what would be our desk? What would be our room? What would be our roles? We don't know. Now, in the last 10 years, we've had the opportunity to, and also different members of you, have had the opportunity to interact with people at different levels. I remember several years ago, you met with the President of India. Bruce, you met with the Pope. Greg, you met with the Chancellor, the Prime Minister of the UK. And several feel, okay, you're meeting with these high-level people. There's a lot of money being, the one in Japan, I remember, was $12 billion. So if we're giving $12 billion, what would we do? And yes, these amounts are big, but at the end of each time they put down the money, we would talk about innovation and new things, don't have a practice, we don't have a ritual, we don't know how to work. So we will give a presentation and they like it, and then the proposal comes and we actually don't know what to do with $12 billion. So I thought, well, why don't we begin to try to shape our practice? And I know some of you have been working along those lines to see what do we know and what can we move forward. What are our ideas? So that's one practical goal. Is that practical enough?
Somewhat, yes.
Niran, I always check with Niran because he says sometimes I could be a bit in the abstract. Okay, so I said, okay, we're going to something. But collectively, we'll try to shape things up. So I'll give a part of my welcome. The order, as you see, now that you get a sense of the problem, the order doesn't matter because you're just coming from different fields. And so it's left to us at the end to try to weave it together into a particular goal. Another thing that is coming up is, which Phil will mention a bit, is we are also in the process of trying to articulate an Institute for Design and Capital Formation on campus, for the science of capital formation, to look at this. And part of that, as I've explained to a lot of people, is that research swings between on-campus and off-campus. Sometimes the knowledge is off-campus and we bring it on campus, and then sometimes it goes off-campus, but it's like a pendulum. And so trying to really understand what's the science of capital formation and how can we have a better understanding of it will be one of the things we're looking into. And also one of the key things that has also come up, and Bruce may speak to that a bit, is that like 20 years ago when we were looking at engineers and say, what the hell are they doing? Why can't they beat the Japanese? Bruce has been looking at the question of what's wrong with bankers? Can we retrain bankers? Because if they continue to behave the way they are behaving, things are not going to change. I guess that room was full of a lot of bankers, and we were just having a nice cocktail after the mess we had gone through. So those will be themes that will come up. One of the other themes that is underneath it is it requires a new form of education, really for all of us, a transition between different disciplines. We've already started 2 courses at Stanford, bringing theory to practice. I know Bruce has started a course with getting students into banking for disaster area. Sharik has done a number of classes in terms of looking at the question of capital and cooling and the environment. So we'll see bits and pieces of that. And then one of the other themes that is emerging is the healthcare industry is facing certain challenges and there are opportunities. Rico has been doing a lot of work in both science as a policy, science policy, as well as drug discovery and trying to accelerate that process. But you'll see several things all of you are doing. It's just I can't grapple with everything. Okay. So I will. So this is some work we did probably about 20 years ago. These are scientists preparing for the Mars mission, Mars exploration rover. So they're meeting, I hope as the day progresses, you'll move around a bit, but this is what the meeting looks like. I just wanted to get a sense of the space. That's a practice. There's nothing formal, but that's how we have been working. So what does our own practice look like as we emerge it? That was at NASA. Some of you are familiar with the class ME310, where Larry Leifer teaches. Larry will join us later. He had a medical appointment earlier on. But that way of working, in which it's not exactly very formal. One of the things we will discuss is the innovation ecosystem. Silicon Valley is just 50 miles by 30 miles. But has been responsible for a lot of wealth creation. And several of you have been studying that process. And several regions of the world would like to have their own capability. It's not so much to replicate the Silicon Valley, but what's the capability and what are things that they can learn from it. So that will be one of the themes that comes up equally. The idea of a teaching hospital where practice, and it's been done in the medical school several years ago with Sharik and Cliff Nass before Cliff passed away. We had the idea of a teaching hospital for looking at the issue of poverty. Bruce has had this idea of a teaching hospital for bankers. But it's really, the teaching hospital is probably our best synthesis of both the research and practice. I guess that's part of where Reiko's work is, looking at transitional medicine, how to go from basic science to the bedside and combining that. It's still a work in the making, I assume, the transitional science. But this is like the design. So have that in mind in terms of how we shift our practices. That's ideal, and I think, I thought I should tell you what the unofficial title of this gathering is. So it has this long name like innovation, and the unofficial title, from my perspective, okay, and this is just mine, this is, what do you call it? You call it rated R. Okay, but, so, okay, the unofficial, because some of you have made me queasy about the unofficial title, particularly Goshe. Okay, but I tell you what the unofficial title is. The unofficial title is Women, Sex, and Bombs. Women, Sex, and Bombs. And the title came about for a couple of reasons. The first is that we've been in both Nigeria and India. And it's clear that if we have to accelerate innovation, we have to focus on women. When you look at that, it's just in a lot of societies, women are not playing as strong a role due to a lot of traditional reasons. But we feel, and our own interest is in accelerating development and innovation. And so we see a need to pay particular attention to how women can be enabled, not just in those countries, but also here, to accelerate development. So that's been very important. And the second is sex. Why sex? Well, Greg had a slide he used to put up that innovation is about ideas having sex. And it's quite neat, but it does a lot because it begins to tell us that there's something intimate about innovation. When you watch people who innovate collaborate, there's a level of intimacy they have to go into. Because in trying to go into the future, we're actually afraid of the future as human beings. And so our existential crisis comes into play. And so that becomes one of the very key things, that what's the level of intimacy? And finally, bombs. Why did I have the idea of bombs? I think part of it was that as we try to change systems are quite resistant to change. You know, and so you find that a lot of the innovation did happen during the Second World War. It's almost like you really have to bomb us to get us to start to do something. And well, so that was the title. I didn't know what the evidence was. But last, I think it was November, I went to listen to a talk by Walter Scheidel. He's a historian. And the historians have been able to gather a lot of data over time. And he said, well, I'll let you just read the top part. Throughout history, the best ways to reduce has been disease and destruction. That we are pretty resistant to culture. And that becomes also interesting to see because the Silicon Valley is at the end of a migration path. And it's almost like I often mention to people that 100 years ago, the Silicon Valley was in Ohio. We had the Wright brothers, we had Thomas Edison, we had Elmer Perry, and several of the inventions, because that was the edge, really, of the human migration system. And now it's like Silicon Valley, and it's like, okay, we finished migrating. So it's almost like you'll have to bomb us to make any change. But the question that I would challenge, pose to us is, well, if we understand a little bit about the Silicon Valley, could we change culture by other means other than war and disease? Currently, we have a lot of people looking at the question of the environment. And again, it's like we're not really moving. And I don't know if Sherry will share some of her data. But part of Sherry's data, looking at the consumer population, said most middle Americans, I think it's middle, okay, do not want to make any sacrifice for the environment. Okay, that it's just, yeah, they talk about it, they are aware of the problem, but they don't want to make a sacrifice. So it looks like we tend to make sacrifices only when we are beaten to it. And so we have to ask the question, are there other ways by which we can have change? Adrienne has been working on the issue of poverty for a while and inequality. And she has some ideas, and I think it would be interesting to have her share some of her ideas and what we might say about it. A few more slides before I stop here. One of the other ideas for this workshop came accidentally. I had been working with a number of people. We had been writing a paper, that's McBeam and Nilima. And this is the normal narrative act for storytelling. In fact, all my life I've been told, okay, you have to tell the good story. And we had actually done a lot of research on storytelling. But it was my first time writing a paper with a lawyer. They actually write very well. Oh, well, okay. Okay, but in that mode, it occurred to me, because of the topic we're writing about, that as an engineer, actually, the way I think is not in stories. You know, and I had been struggling with how do I think over probably about, well, ever since I was born, but like, recently in the last 2 or 3 years, I'd been struggling because the story was disappearing, and Neeraj was able to help me. I would sort of send what I'd written to him to put it in a story form, because that's how people expect it to be. But in the crisis of the moment, I realized most of my thinking at that stage was really mapping. I wasn't doing storytelling, I was actually mapping. And so and we had then gotten a review of the paper we submitted, where the reviewers were quite harsh. And I realized, well, you know, I don't write like that. This is how I write. So I had to write the paper and tell the reviewers, okay, here's how I'm going to write. But in that moment, I realized that this was how we actually modeled the world, that given a fiscal system, we try to represent it mathematically, and there's a discontinuity in that representation because we're making a lot of approximations. But once we solve mathematics, we bring it back down. And so it's the real world and the abstract world, and we just move in between. Now, some people try to say, well, but you're going this way. No, because of the discontinuities. And so what the authors found, that what they were arguing for was the discontinuity. And I said, well, the discontinuity is just something we live with in engineering, that there's the physical and there's a mathematical concept, and they don't merge. But what it turns out, Bill Clancy, which some of you know, he was one of the early people who was also trying to develop computer programs to mimic engineers. And they came up with a way, they called it heuristic classification. You take data, which is the real world, into an abstraction, you use some heuristics to solve it, and you come back to refine it. So he was able to find that a lot of the AI systems that they were doing were basically, well, to copy engineers, had that progression. Yesterday, as I was talking to Greg, he had a meeting with people from the defense, DOE. Can you say a bit about that, the twinning?
Oh, digital twinning?
Yeah.
The idea that one of the ways to test out a lot of these social and economic phenomena is to build virtual models, and you can then actually use code to tie actions in the digital models to actual processes in the physical world. And they can do everything from machines, where you can figure out how to use machines, and then as you turn dials on that, it actually turns the dials on real machines. So it's one of the things we're looking at for our ecosystem.
Okay, so they use the word digital twinning, and I said, well, okay, that's how we typically do things. And so part of what you'll be seeing is a lot of maps, but how do we move between the digital maps and the real world maps and back? That will be one of the key things we try to do. Okay, you've seen the themes, the agenda. Okay. I wanted to share, okay. Rolf Faste was one of the professors here, and who's had one of the best intuition about innovation, and I wanted to share this with you. If you take a few minutes to read it. So the subject of courage becomes one of the things that, if we had to understand innovation and invention, courage becomes really something that we need to understand it in one way. I tend to, he calls this his model, the poached egg model. In other words, if you have a poached egg, then you'll see some bubble appearing. And then when it appears, that's where it forms the main, where the egg becomes, cooked. But he mentioned one thing: once it's cooked there, people who are innovators, they move away, they go west. So we're always looking for what's the new thing, what's the next new thing. So he puts it in this way that you can see these two lines here. Culture will move. And that's the shift, and culture is becoming more digital. But the innovators are already moving to the next frontier. So that's one of the aspects that is made. The other thing that this graph reminds me of is the first time I met Phil. He has been curating material from venture capitalists. And he said he encourages them to live on the edge. If you think of a bell curve, and the edges becomes where you have to live to push the frontier forward. But Rolf's focus on courage was very, very interesting, because how do you get courage? How do we measure courage? Becomes an important question in our research. And it's something we knew it was there, but how to get courage was very, very difficult. How do we measure it? And that came, some of the ideas of how we might measure courage, okay, came by accident. I think Phil and myself were writing a paper, and to cut the long story short, he sent me a video, and the video basically said, here's how you could measure courage. So I'll leave you, my last slide is a short video about how we might measure courage. Phil, do you know what that is?
Yeah.
I know.
I hope it's good.
Somehow Phil's afraid.
Oh, this one. Okay. All right. I never know what videos I send people.
Okay, so the speaker, it will just get to part of her presentation.
I think everybody.
And maybe the hardest part about my life ending is that I learned something hard about myself, and that was that as much as I would be frustrated about not being able to get my work out to the world, there was a part of me that was working very hard to engineer staying small, staying right under the radar. But I want to talk about what I've learned. There's two things that I've learned in the last year. The first is vulnerability is not weakness. And that myth is profoundly dangerous. Let me ask you honestly, and I'll give you this warning. I'm trained as a therapist, so I can outweight you uncomfortably. So if you could just raise your hand, that would be awesome. How many of you, honestly, when you're thinking about doing something vulnerable or saying something vulnerable, think, God, vulnerability is weakness, this is weakness? How many of you think of vulnerability and weakness synonymously? The majority of people. Now let me ask you this question. This past week at TED, how many of you, when you saw vulnerability up here, thought it was pure courage? Vulnerability is not weakness. I define vulnerability as emotional risk, exposure, uncertainty. It fuels our daily lives. And I've come to the belief, this is my 12th year doing this research, that vulnerability is our most accurate measurement of courage. To be vulnerable, to let ourselves be seen, to be honest. One of the weird things that's happened is after the TED explosion, I got a lot of offers to speak all over the country. Everyone from schools and parent meetings to Fortune 500 companies. And so many of the calls went like this. Hey, Dr. Brown, we loved your TED Talk. We'd like you to come in and speak. We'd appreciate it if you wouldn't mention vulnerability or shame. What would you like for me to talk about? There's three big answers. This is mostly, to be honest with you, from the business sector. Innovation, creativity, and change. So let me go on the record and say, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. To create is to make something that has never existed before. There's nothing more vulnerable than that. Adaptability to change is all about vulnerability. The second thing, in addition...
Okay, so vulnerability is what I'm asking you all to step into. As I mentioned in the invitation, we don't know the goal. It's a lot of information. I can barely take in the amount of information, say, Phil has or Reiko. It's a lot. But you've all done your different disciplines in a very, very important way. So in the first half, we'll just have sort of 10 minutes. But when we come back, we can begin to see the pieces, to begin to fit the puzzles together.